My name is Audrey Claire. I am 34 years old. My parents spent the $150,000 my grandfather left as a joint legacy fund for both his grandchildren to pay for my brother's lavish country club wedding and his failed luxury yacht brokerage in Annapolis. Then they looked me in the eye and told me that because I was a successful senior architectural conservator who had spent a decade restoring Philadelphia's historic landmarks, I was too independent to need a single cent for my own wedding. I spent my entire career bringing life back to crumbling limestone and forgotten facades in Rittenhouse Square, only to realize that the people who raised me had been quietly eroding my own foundation for years while I wasn't looking. They watched me work 60-hour weeks to build my own 401k and savings, all while they were liquidating my future to subsidize a son who never had to prove himself. And when the truth about that stolen inheritance finally surfaced at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Napa Valley, it wasn't just a wedding budget that collapsed. It was the 3-decade-old illusion of what it means to be a daughter in the St. Clair family. They watched me restore the history of strangers while they were busy erasing mine. And I found out the truth from a bank statement that arrived 3 weeks after my own father told me to pay my own way. If that hits you somewhere, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Because that missing money was only the first layer of the betrayal I was about to uncover. For 34 years, I operated under the quiet belief that if I just worked hard enough, stayed out of trouble, and built a life of unassailable professional merit, I would eventually earn the same seat at the table as my older brother. I became a senior architectural conservator, a specialist in historic masonry and structural preservation, which meant I was the person Philadelphia's elite called when their century-old brownstones started to crack or their Victorian estates required the kind of delicate touch that only comes from years of postgraduate study and field expertise. I have a corner office overlooking Logan Square, where I spend my mornings studying blueprints of the mid-19th century, a healthy, diversified portfolio, and I haven't asked my parents for a loan or a favor since the day I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. I thought my independence was a point of pride for them, but as I sat across from my father in a cramped booth at a local diner, I realized that in his eyes, my success wasn't an achievement, it was an excuse to withhold the support they had lavished on my brother. I kept thinking, I spent my life making sure I would never be a burden, and now they're using that strength as a reason to treat me like a stranger who doesn't deserve the very heritage I've spent my career trying to honor. My parents, Arthur and Beatrice St. Clair, 65 and 62, a retired dean of admissions at a private prep school and a former owner of a high-end bridal boutique, live in a 4-bedroom colonial in Bryn Mawr. They are the kind of people who define themselves by the zip codes they frequent and the reputations they've polished. People who spent their lives making sure the St. Clair name was synonymous with mainline stability and traditional American values. My father spent 4 decades deciding which children were worthy of an elite education, a man who mastered the art of the calculated exclusion. And my mother spent her career dressing the most prominent brides in Pennsylvania. Yet they couldn't seem to find any room in their hearts for a daughter who didn't fit into the rigid mold they'd designed. They are comfortable in the way only people with a paid-off mortgage and a vacation home in Cape May can be. Yet, they cling to their social standing like it's the only thing keeping them from the shame of being ordinary. My brother, Grant St. Clair, 38, a luxury yacht broker in Annapolis, which was really just a fancy title for a man who sold high-end boats to people with more money than sense, was the golden child, the star quarterback, and the perpetual investment that never seemed to yield a return. 3 years ago, when he married his wife, my parents turned it into the social event of the season, spending $127,000 on a black tie reception at the Marion Cricket Club that included a 10-piece swing band and imported orchids from the Netherlands. My mother spent that entire night circulating among the guests with a flute of expensive champagne, making sure everyone knew they had been saving for that moment since the day their firstborn son took his first breath. I stood in the back of that ballroom, in a silk bridesmaid dress that I had to pay to have tailored twice, watching my father give a toast about the sanctity of family legacy, and I felt a small, naive hope that when my time came, they would show me that I was just as much a part of that legacy as he was. I met my husband, Julian Sterling, 36, a pediatric cardiologist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, at a gala for the Preservation Alliance, where he was the only person who seemed more interested in the exposed brickwork than the silent auction. He is a man whose hands are steady enough to repair a child's heart, but gentle enough to hold mine when it was breaking. A man with a quiet confidence that comes from a family that actually values character over pedigree. When Julian proposed on a crisp October evening on the rooftop of our favorite restaurant, the city lights of Philadelphia glittering below us, I let myself believe that maybe the long, cold war with my parents was finally over, that they would finally see me as a woman who had built her own kingdom and was now ready to welcome them into it. The Sunday dinner was my father's idea, a summons to their home in Bryn Mawr to discuss the logistics of the wedding. We made it through the first course of salad before my father cleared his throat and pulled a legal pad from his pocket, laying out what he called the mandatory guidelines for a St. Clair wedding. It was a rigid plan, a calculated list of demands that ignored everything Julian and I wanted for our intimate, child-free ceremony. Rule 1. All family must be invited, including distant cousins I hadn't seen since the 4th grade and the largest donors to my father's former school's endowment. Rule 2. No child-free wedding, because children were the future of the lineage. Rule 3. No destination wedding. The ceremony would stay local at the Episcopal church where they had been married. He looked up with the same clinical detachment he used to use when denying an admissions application, and he told me that if I didn't agree to these terms, I would be funding the entire venture myself. I sat there in that familiar, stiff-backed chair, looking at my father's precise, cramped handwriting, and the only thought I had was that he was treating my wedding like a business transaction, where I was the only party expected to forfeit my own agency. I tried to explain that we wanted an intimate gathering of 80 guests at a private vineyard, a place where we could actually speak to our friends without the noise of a 200-person crowd. But my father didn't even blink. He just repeated that children were family, and that my mother had already promised Aunt Marge and the Hendersons from church that they would be receiving invitations in the mail. The true structural failure didn't reveal itself until I called my brother later that night from the passenger seat of Julian's car, the rain streaking the windshield as we drove through the darkened streets of the main line. I asked him if he could talk to them, if he could explain that modern weddings weren't the same as they were 30 years ago. But my brother just let out a heavy, uncomfortable He told me that I knew how they were, that they were old-fashioned, and then he let the truth slip out like a loose stone in a historic wall. He mentioned the investment account, the legacy fund our grandfather had started for us decades ago that was supposed to be split evenly between the two of us. I gripped my phone so hard my knuckles went white as I realized what he was saying. That there was a fund of $150,000 that was supposed to be half mine, but my parents had already liquidated the entire balance to cover my brother's debts and his lavish celebration. I understood then that the $100,000 my mother had promised in her initial email wasn't a gift. It was a lie designed to maintain control over a daughter they had already robbed in secret. I realized that for 29 years, I hadn't been an equal member of the family. I had been the unpaid insurance policy for my brother's failures, and my parents were now asking me to pay for my own wedding with the very money they had stolen from my future. I sat in the silence of my Philadelphia apartment for 3 hours after that phone call, watching the taillights of cars on the Vine Street Expressway blur into long red streaks of light that looked like open wounds across the city's concrete skin. The realization wasn't a sharp, sudden pain. It was the slow, cold weight of a foundation shifting beneath a historic building. The kind of structural failure you don't actually see until the load-bearing walls start to buckle and the plaster begins to dust the floor. My parents hadn't just withheld a gift. They had embezzled my autonomy to fund my brother's chronic mediocrity, taking the $75,000 that was legally and morally intended for my stability and using it to buy shrimp cocktail and an ice sculpture for a son who still hasn't figured out how to pay his own mortgage in Annapolis without a subsidized check from home. I kept thinking, they didn't just choose him over me. They chose to make me pay for his life with the pieces of mine they stole before I was even old enough to understand the ledger. And they expect me to smile for the wedding photos while the check for my inheritance is sitting in my brother's overdrawn bank account. When I called my father the next morning, I didn't mention the legacy investment account right away because I wanted to see if there was a single shred of integrity left in the man who spent his career teaching ethics and traditional values to prep school boys. I asked him one simple question. If Julian and I agreed to his mandatory guidelines, where exactly was the $100,000 coming from, given that they had always told me they lived on a fixed retirement income? There was on the other end of the line, the kind of heavy, calculated silence I'd heard him use 1,000 times during admissions hearings when he was deciding which legacy student to admit and which merit scholar to reject. He told me that the source of the gift was irrelevant, and that family doesn't audit one another, his voice carrying that familiar mainline condescension that implies any quest for clarity is a betrayal of class and character. It was a power play, a demand for total surrender in exchange for what I now knew was a fraudulent promise. He wanted me to stand in that Episcopal church in front of the wealthiest donors to his school's endowment, playing the part of the dutiful St. Clair daughter, while he secretly used my presence to validate the very lies that had erased my future. He wanted a trophy for his mantle, not a daughter for his life. And he was willing to blackmail me with my own stolen money to ensure the scaffolding of his reputation didn't collapse in front of his country club peers. The social pylon began 3 days later, a coordinated campaign of public shaming that only a woman who owned a high-end bridal boutique could orchestrate with such theatrical precision. It started with a text from Aunt Marge, a woman who defines her entire existence by her position in the church choir and her collection of vintage Hermes scarves, telling me she was praying for my hardened heart, and that she couldn't understand why I was shutting out the people who sacrificed everything for my Ivy League education. Then came the calls from the Hendersons, friends of my parents from the Bryn Mawr Country Club, people I hadn't spoken to in a decade, all of them suddenly experts on my moral obligations and the sacred debt I supposedly owed to the people who were currently raiding my safety deposit box. My mother sat in her living room in Bryn Mawr and told our entire extended family that I was abandoning them for a life of wealthy elitism in Philadelphia just because I asked to see the bank statements for the fund my grandfather left me. If you know what it feels like to be cast as the villain in a story where you're actually the victim, tell me what you would have done. Like and subscribe. because the Facebook post she was about to write was designed to ensure that every bridge I had ever built was burned to the ground before sunset. By Thursday, the mainline gossip mill was in full production, and my mother, Beatrice, had taken to Facebook with a calculated, martyr-like precision that would have been impressive if it wasn't so spiritually destructive. She posted a photo of the empty chair at her mahogany dining room table, captioned with a Bible verse about honoring thy father and mother, followed by a 3-paragraph lament about how modern independence was a poison that destroyed traditional family unity, and how her heart was breaking for a daughter who had forgotten the value of her own blood. Within 2 hours, there were 50 comments from church members, local boutique owners, and neighbors, all of them vilifying a woman they hadn't seen since my Penn graduation, calling me ungrateful, cold, and blinded by my own career ambitions in the city. I was in the middle of a site inspection at a mid-19th century cathedral in Rittenhouse Square, standing on a rusting scaffold 40 feet in the air with the smell of damp stone and ancient mortar filling my lungs, when my phone started vibrating with notifications from cousins I barely remembered. I stood there, looking out over the spires of Philadelphia, reading comments from people who thought they knew the architecture of my soul because they'd read a status update from a woman who had stolen my inheritance to pay for my brother's Monaco bachelor party. The humiliation was a physical weight, a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. And I realized that my mother wasn't just grieving a wedding. She was performing a public execution of my character to distract everyone from the rot in her own house. I kept thinking, she's making me the wrecking ball in our family's history, just so no one looks at the cracks she and my father put in the foundation themselves 20 years ago. And she's doing it with a smile and a prayer request. Julian found me that evening in our kitchen, my phone face down on the Carrera marble counter, my eyes red from the kind of frustrated, silent tears that come when you realize you're fighting a war with people who have no interest in the truth. He didn't tell me to let it go or ignore them because he's a pediatric cardiologist. He knows that you don't ignore a structural defect in the heart and hope it fixes itself. He pulled me into his arms, the smell of his hospital scrubs a grounding contrast to the perfumed lies of the main line, and he told me that we were done playing by their rules, that the St. Clair guidelines were nothing more than a script for a play we were no longer auditioning for. The next morning, I did something I should have done the moment I saw my father's legal pad. I called my executive event designer, Cassandra, a woman who had built a multi-million-dollar business out of curating the most exclusive weddings in the Northeast, and who had been my roommate during our freshman year at Penn. I told her to scrap the Bryn Mawr plans, to cancel the Episcopal Church, and to move everything to a private vineyard estate in Napa Valley. I told her that the guest list was being cut from 200 to 80, and that the St. Clair name was to be scrubbed from every vendor contract and seating chart like a stain on a historic monument. Cassandra didn't ask a single question. She knew the legacy of the St. Clair family, and she knew that when I spoke in that calm, professional tone I used for condemning a building, it meant the restoration was over and the demolition had officially begun. She told me she would have a new proposal on my desk by Monday, and that she would personally handle the security detail to ensure that uninvited ghosts stayed exactly where they belonged, on the other side of the country, clutching their worthless guidelines and their Facebook martyrs. I felt a brief, sharp moment of peace as I hit send on a short, formal email to my parents, a digital boundary that felt like bolting the doors to a cathedral. I told them that Julian and I had decided to fund the wedding ourselves, that the ceremony would be intimate and private, and that while they were welcome to attend as guests, they would have no role in the planning, the seating, or the ceremony itself. I told them that the offer of their $100,000 was declined, and that I hoped they could find a better use for the money, perhaps to pay off the interest on my brother's latest business loan in Annapolis. I didn't wait for a response. I blocked their numbers and went back to work. I had a landmark to save, and for the first time in my life, I realized that the most important piece of history I needed to restore wasn't made of stone or mortar. It was the woman I had almost let them bury. The first time Julian took me to meet his mother, Lydia Sterling, I spent 3 hours in my Rittenhouse Square apartment rehearsing my professional credentials like I was preparing for a deposition before the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. I wore my most expensive charcoal blazer from Nordstrom, polished my leather portfolio, and mentally cataloged every successful structural restoration I had overseen in the last 5 years, fully expecting a cross-examination on my pedigree and my long-term financial viability. I was a St. Clair, after all, and in my family, you didn't just walk into a room. You justified your presence there with a balance sheet, a list of social connections, and a genealogy that passed the mainline litmus test. I assumed that any woman who served as a university provost would view a potential daughter-in-law the same way my father viewed an admissions applicant, as a set of data points to be audited for institutional fit and social capital. My mother-in-law, Lydia Sterling, 64, a retired university provost and active board chair for the Philadelphia Museum of Art, lived in a 19th century stone manor in Chestnut Hill that smelled of beeswax, old books, and the kind of quiet wealth that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The house was a masterpiece of Gothic Revival architecture, built from Wissahickon schist with hand-carved limestone lintels, the kind of place I would usually spend weeks meticulously documenting for a preservation survey. The ivy-covered stone walls and leaded glass windows spoke of a permanence that my parents' manicured Bryn Mawr colonial could never replicate. But as we pulled into the circular gravel driveway, I wasn't looking at the superior masonry or the historic integrity of the slate roof. I was trying to keep my hands from shaking against the leather upholstery of Julian's car. I kept thinking, I have a master's from Penn and a senior conservator title. But if I don't have my father's approval and his legacy fund, am I even a person she'll want to talk to? Or am I just a temporary fixture she'll want to replace with someone from a more cooperative family? The door didn't open to a stiff-necked butler or a formal foyer reception. It opened to Lydia herself, wearing a simple navy cashmere sweater and a pair of worn gardening clogs, her hair pulled back in a silver knot that looked like it hadn't seen a professional stylist in weeks. She didn't wait for an introduction or a recitation of my professional resume. She stepped onto the flagstone porch and wrapped me in a hug that smelled faintly of lavender and rain, telling me that Julian talked about me so much she felt like she was finally welcoming a long-lost daughter home. There was no surveying of my outfit, no calculating glance at my jewelry to determine my net worth, just a genuine warmth that felt like the first day of spring after a decade-long Philadelphia winter. Dinner wasn't a 6-course performance designed to impress potential donors. It was roast chicken with rosemary and root vegetables served in a warm, sun-drenched kitchen that overlooked a wildflower garden. There were no fluorescent lights or faded wallpaper, no framed photos of high school football glory meant to remind everyone of who the true star of the family was. Instead, the walls were covered in actual art. Sketches from local artists, framed maps of old Philadelphia, and photos of Julian as a boy. Not as a star athlete, but as a kid with messy hair holding a stray cat. She sat across from me in that sun-drenched kitchen and didn't ask about my father's status or my mother's boutique. She just asked me why I loved the way the light hit the stone on the Rittenhouse facades. And then she told me I was finally home. If that kind of unconditional warmth makes your eyes sting a little, just leave a heart below, like and subscribe. Because what she told me next about her own battle with a family that demanded obedience made me realize I wasn't the first person to have to choose between a name and a life. As the evening wore on, the tension that had been coiled in my spine for 3 decades began to unfurl, piece by piece, like vines being cleared from a smothered landmark. For the first time in my life, I was at a dinner table where my worth wasn't being audited. Lydia didn't care about the mainline gossip or the Facebook posts my mother was currently circulating. She wanted to know about my dreams for the city's skyline, about the historic masonry techniques I was studying, and about the quiet life Julian and I were building together. When Julian went to the kitchen to uncork another bottle of wine, my mother-in-law reached across the distressed oak table and squeezed my hand, her voice dropping to a gentle, steady register that carried the weight of lived wisdom. She told me that when she chose to marry Julian's father, a young public interest lawyer with 0 family connections, her own parents had refused to attend the ceremony, telling her she was marrying beneath the sterling reputation. They had tried to use their influence at the university to sway her, threatening to withdraw her inheritance and remove her from the family trust if she didn't choose a man with a more appropriate pedigree. She had spent 3 years in total silence before they finally realized that she wasn't a piece of property they could manage, but a woman who had built her own foundation. She looked me in the eye and told me that love doesn't come with a set of mandatory guidelines, and that if my parents couldn't see the landmark of a woman I had become, that was a failure of their own vision, not a flaw in my design. I sat there in that Chestnut Hill kitchen, surrounded by the warmth of a family I hadn't been born into, and I realized that I had spent 29 years trying to restore a relationship that was structurally unsound from the start. I had been applying mortar to a wall that was designed to collapse, trying to earn the approval of people who saw me as an asset rather than a person. I realized that my mother's boutique and my father's prep school were just theatrical sets, and I was the only one who had been trying to live a real life inside of them. I kept telling myself that maybe if I achieved enough, they would finally stop comparing me to my brother. But most of us know that feeling, when you're sprinting toward a finish line that the people you love keep moving further away just to see how long you'll keep running. It's the exhaustion of realizing you're an extra in someone else's play, and no matter how well you perform your lines, you'll never be the lead. You realize you've been sacrificing your own authenticity to maintain a facade for a family that would replace you the second you stopped serving their image. When Julian drove me back to Rittenhouse Square that night, I didn't feel the usual post-family exhaustion that usually required a full day of recovery. I felt a clarity that was almost terrifying. The kind of sharp perspective you get when you finally strip away the layers of gray paint from a marble statue and see the veins of the stone for the first time. I realized that my senior architectural conservator training had taught me how to identify what was worth saving and what was too far gone. And for the first time, I was applying that logic to the St. Clair name. I wasn't destroying a family. I was decommissioning a toxic structure to make room for something that could actually stand the test of time. As I looked out the window at the Gothic spires of the Philadelphia skyline, the city I had helped restore, I knew that the battle for my wedding was only the beginning. My father hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He had stolen the sense of security that every child is supposed to have. And I knew him well enough to know that he wouldn't let me walk away without one final, irrational act of destruction designed to bring me back to my knees. He wouldn't just withhold the legacy fund. He would try to dismantle the very reputation I had built in this city, stone by stone, until there was nothing left but the rubble. But as I looked at the Sterling family home fading in the distance, I knew I was no longer building alone. I kept thinking, for the first time in my life, I'm not restoring a ruin. I'm building a sanctuary. And this time, the foundation is made of truth, not theatrical guidelines. The confrontation didn't happen in the stiff silence of a Bryn Mawr dining room or through the filtered lens of a social media post. It arrived at the glass-walled lobby of my architectural firm in Rittenhouse Square on a Tuesday morning while I was in the middle of a high-stakes consultation with the board of directors for a historic library restoration. I was explaining the tensile strength of 19th century ironwork and the necessity of repointing the masonry with period-accurate lime mortar when my assistant knocked on the door with a look of sheer panic on her face that I usually only see when a structural survey reveals a terminal crack in a load-bearing wall. She told me there was a woman at the reception desk who claimed to be my mother, and she was currently informing the entire waiting room, including two of my most prominent municipal clients, that I was a cold-hearted opportunist who was abandoning her family's legacy to chase a life of vanity in the city. My mother, Beatrice, stood by the white marble reception counter, her mascara streaking down her cheeks in a way that I knew from 30 years of observation was meticulously calculated for maximum theatrical impact. She was wearing her best Chanel-style suit, clutching a damp tissue like it was a holy relic, and as I approached, her voice rose to a pitch designed to carry into the open-plan offices where my colleagues and junior associates were trying to focus on their CAD designs. She grabbed my arm in front of the receptionist, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman who was supposedly trembling with grief, and she began to beg me to end this nightmare before it destroyed my father's health and the St. Clair name was dragged through the shame of a public falling out. I kept thinking, I spent 10 years building a reputation for clinical precision and professional steel in a male-dominated industry, and she's trying to liquefy it in 5 minutes just to prove she still has the power to make me flinch in front of the people who respect me. I led her into a private conference room, feeling every pair of eyes on my back as the heavy glass door clicked shut, cutting off the whispers of the office and leaving us in a space that smelled of expensive coffee and the blueprints of a city's future. The moment we were alone, the theatrical tears stopped, and her expression shifted into the sharp, cold mask of the boutique owner who knew exactly how to close a difficult sale by identifying her opponent's weakest point. She didn't ask about my wedding or the life I was building with Julian. She told me that my little act of independence was embarrassing the family at the country club, and that my father was prepared to overlook my emotional outburst regarding the wedding if I signed a formal apology and returned to the St. Clair guidelines immediately. When I refused, she didn't scream. She just reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a manila folder, sliding a notarized document across the mahogany table that made the blood drain from my face faster than any structural failure ever could. It was a liquidation statement for a 529 college savings plan that my grandfather had opened in my name when I was 4 years old. A fund that I had maintained through 3 jobs and a 4.0 GPA, specifically so that the surplus would be there as a safety net for my future home or my own children's education. But as I scanned the transaction history, I saw that the entire balance, $60,000, had been withdrawn 2 years ago via a power of attorney I didn't even know existed, all to cover a margin call on my brother Grant's failed luxury yacht brokerage in Annapolis. The folder sat on that mahogany table, and I realized I was looking at the documented theft of 10 years of my hard work used to pay for a son's reckless mistakes while I was working double shifts at the university. If you think you know which folder I pushed back across that table, drop a yes or no in the comments, like and subscribe. Because I was about to find out that my father had one more move left that would target the very career I had built from nothing. I looked at my mother, the woman who had spent decades carefully curating the image of a devoted and selfless parent, and I realized that the betrayal was total and structurally integrated into my life. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They had harvested my diligence to subsidize my brother's reckless incompetence, watching me exhaust myself at the university and sacrifice my youth to stay debt-free while they were silently emptying my safety deposit box to keep Grant from facing the consequences of his own bad decisions. They had used my scholarships as a financial opportunity for him, treating my success as a resource to be liquidated whenever the golden son needed another bailout to maintain his performance of success. I kept thinking, they didn't just take the money. They took the thousands of hours of my life I spent working to save it. And they did it while smiling at me across the Thanksgiving table and telling me they were proud of my self-reliance. My mother didn't even have the decency to look ashamed as I pointed to the withdrawal signature. She simply told me that Grant is the one who will carry the name forward, and that as a high-earning senior architectural conservator in Philadelphia, I didn't need the security of that fund as much as he needed a lifeline for his business. She said that family was a collective, and that my individual achievement was merely a tool for the survival of the St. Clair reputation, an irrational perversion of the American dream that suggested my hard work belonged to everyone but me. The final blow came that Friday, in the form of a formal letter from my father, delivered to my office via a private courier like a summons to an execution. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation. It was a calculated act of professional sabotage designed to dismantle my standing in the architectural community. My father, Arthur, had used his considerable influence as a retired dean and a longtime consultant for the city's educational endowments to express concern to the Historical Commission about my recent emotional instability and personal conflicts. He was attempting to disrupt a prestigious grant I was applying for, a 3-year municipal project to restore the exterior masonry of Philadelphia City Hall, by suggesting that my personal drama made me a liability for such a high-profile government contract. He was willing to destroy the career I had built from the ground up, just to prove that I was nothing without his permission, targeting my livelihood, my reputation, and the sacred trust I had established with the city I spent my life preserving. He was trying to evict me from my own professional identity because I wouldn't let him direct the choreography of my wedding day. And for the first time, I realized that the man who taught me about honor was the most dishonorable person I had ever known. I sat at my desk overlooking Logan Square, the letter from the commission trembling in my hand, and for a moment, I felt the foundation of my life cracking under a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. Most people don't understand the crushing weight of a father's shadow until he decides to use it to block out your son. And I felt like a landmark being slated for demolition by the very people who were supposed to be my architects. But as I looked at the skyline of Philadelphia, a city that had survived fires, wars, and centuries of decay, I realized that real landmarks don't fall just because someone removes the scaffolding. I wasn't a temporary fixture in the St. Clair legacy. I was the only thing in that family that was built to last. And if my father wanted to test the structural integrity of my resolve, I was going to show him exactly what a St. Clair woman looked like when she stopped asking for permission to exist. The drive from San Francisco International Airport to Napa Valley was the first time in 6 months that the air in my lungs didn't feel like it was being filtered through construction dust and heavy industrial-grade regret. Julian and I sat in the back of a black town car, watching the rolling hills of the California wine country shift from a vibrant, sun-drenched green to the deep, bruised purple of twilight. And for a few hours, the mainline gossip and my father's threatening legal letters felt like they belonged to a different, much smaller century. We were heading toward a private vineyard estate, a secluded property in the Stag's Leap district where the limestone soils produce some of the finest Cabernet Sauvignon in the world, and where my executive event designer, Cassandra, had spent the last week meticulously staging the sanctuary where I would finally claim my own name without the scaffold of my parents' approval. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be a quiet, Michelin-starred celebration for 30 people. Just our closest friends from Philadelphia, the Sterlings, and a handful of colleagues who had refused to be intimidated by my father's professional influence. We were gathered on a stone terrace overlooking the valley, the fairy lights strung between ancient oak trees casting a soft amber glow over a long table set with Italian linens and white peonies. The air was cool, the smell of ripening grapes and dry earth a grounding contrast to the stagnant, perfumed air of the Bryn Mawr Country Club I had left behind. I kept thinking, this is what family is supposed to feel like. A solid structure built on mutual respect and shared joy, not a shaky scaffolding held together by threats, stolen legacy funds, and the constant fear of social eviction. The quiet before the storm lasted exactly 45 minutes. Just long enough for the first course of Dungeness crab to be served, and for Lydia to give a warm, unhurried toast about the sacred beauty of restoration and the strength it takes to build a new life from old stone. But then, the sound of gravel crunching under tires echoed from the estate's long, winding driveway, and I felt the familiar, icy constriction in my chest before I even saw the white rental Cadillac pull up to the tasting room. My heart stopped when I saw them walk through the wrought iron gates. My parents, looking like they had stepped out of a mainline social register, wearing the same expressions of injured righteousness they used to wear when denying a scholarship to a student they deemed socially incompatible with their vision of the school. My mother, Beatrice, led the way, her silk floral dress fluttering in the evening breeze, her eyes already darting across the guest list as if she were auditing a tax return for potential deductions. My father, Arthur, followed 2 paces behind, his navy blazer buttoned tight, his jaw set in the same rigid, uncompromising line he used to use when expelling a boy from his prep school for a breach of etiquette. They walked right past the confused hostess, my mother informing her in a signed to be heard by the entire terrace that she was the mother of the bride and that there had obviously been a grievous clerical error regarding their seating assignment at the head of the table. I stood up, my heels clicking against the ancient stone pavers like hammer strikes on a cold chisel, and I met them at the edge of the terrace before they could reach the Sterling family. I kept my voice low and clinical, the same voice I used when delivering a terminal diagnosis to a structural beam in a historic cathedral. I told them they weren't on the list, that they had exhausted their invitation the moment they tried to sabotage my career at the commission. But my father didn't even look at me. He looked at Lydia, who had risen from her seat with the quiet, unshakable authority of a university provost who had dealt with difficult, entitled parents for 40 years. The confrontation moved to a private cellar room downstairs, a cool, dark space lined with racks of aging vintage wine, where the smell of damp earth and French oak was heavy enough to taste. My parents sat on one side of a rough-hewn tasting table, and for the first time in my life, the mainline performance started to fail under the weight of Julian's clinical presence. My father didn't apologize for the letters or the stolen 529 plan. He simply told me that family matters were private and that my refusal to cooperate with the St. Clair tradition was forcing his hand into measures he didn't want to take, as if his betrayal was merely a reaction to my existence. That was when my husband placed a manila folder on the table, a document he had obtained from his real estate attorney that afternoon after a routine title search on my grandfather's Cape May cottage. I watched my father's face turn the color of wet, weathered cement as I opened the folder to reveal a notarized quitclaim deed. It was a document that purported to show my signature, waiving my half of the property rights to the family's coastal legacy, a cottage left to both my brother Grant and me in a joint trust. My father had forged my name to use the unencumbered equity of that house as collateral for a high-interest SBA loan to bail out my brother for the third time in 5 years. I kept thinking, he didn't just steal the money I earned through labor. He forged my very identity to steal the one piece of history my grandfather wanted me to keep. And he did it while scolding me about the importance of family name. It was a felony in the state of Pennsylvania, a criminal act of forgery and fraud that would instantly void the deed and likely trigger a federal investigation into the loan application. But my father just stared at the notary's stamp and told me that Grant needed a bridge to get through the fiscal quarter. He said that as a senior architectural conservator, I had plenty of assets and a wealthy partner, while my brother was fighting for his professional livelihood. He actually believed that stealing my property rights was a legitimate form of family redistribution, and he expected me to swallow the loss for the sake of a son who had already liquidated my future. The irrationality of it was staggering. A retired dean of admissions, a man who spent his life judging the character and potential of others, was sitting in a Napa Valley wine cellar admitting to a felony because he couldn't bear to see his golden son face the consequences of a bad business deal. He had negated the American happiness of home ownership and individual property rights, turning my grandfather's legacy into a hollow shell, just to buy my brother another 6 months of pretending to be a success. My mother, Beatrice, didn't even look at the forged signature on the Cape May deed. She looked at Lydia and told her that people of our class don't involve the authorities in family disagreements. She expected the Sterlings to collude in the cover-up, to accept the betrayal as a quirk of old money dynamics. But she had severely miscalculated the structural integrity of the people I had chosen. My mother-in-law didn't say a word. She just stood up, and the look of absolute clinical pity in her eyes was more devastating than any scream my mother could have produced. I told my parents to leave the estate immediately, that their presence was no longer a request but a trespass, and that if they didn't vacate the vineyard, I would allow Julian's attorney to call the Napa County Sheriff to escort them out in front of the Michelin-starred staff. I told my father that the notarized deed was going to a forensic document examiner the moment we returned to Philadelphia, and that the only reason I wasn't calling the police right then was because I didn't want the stain of his mugshot to be the only thing I remembered about my wedding weekend. They walked out of that stone cellar in a suffocating silence, leaving behind the lingering smell of expensive perfume and desperate, low-level lies. I stood there, leaning against a rack of Cabernet, and for the first time in 34 years, I realized that I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel broken. I felt clean, like a landmark that had finally been stripped of a century of toxic lead paint, revealing the unbreakable stone beneath. I had uncovered the rot in the load-bearing walls, and I was no longer obligated to live inside the collapse just to keep the facade from falling. I woke on my wedding day to the kind of unbroken California sunshine that feels like a benediction, the sort of light that senior architectural conservators spend years trying to replicate in drafty Philadelphia galleries with expensive halogen bulbs. Cassandra appeared at my door at 8 a.m. sharp with a bottle of chilled Veuve Clicquot and a team of stylists who treated my Monique Lhuillier gown with more reverence than a first edition blueprint. The dress was a gift from Lydia, a masterpiece of French lace and silk lining that felt less like a social requirement and more like a suit of armor, designed for a woman who was finally ready to stand on her own soil. The ceremony began at 5 o'clock, just as the golden hour began to liquidate the sharp edges of the Napa Hills. 85 guests were gathered on the stone terrace, a string quartet playing an arrangement of Appalachian Spring that echoed through the vines. I walked down that long slate aisle alone. No father to give me away. No patriarchal hand to transfer my ownership like a title deed. I was giving myself of my own free will to a man who valued my soul more than my pedigree. And as I took my husband's hands under a pergola draped in white jasmine, I realized that the seats I had left empty for my parents weren't symbols of loss. They were spaces where the truth could finally breathe. The structural failure of the St. Clair legacy didn't fully reveal itself until the reception, during a quiet moment between the toasts and the first dance. I was standing in a secluded corner of the vineyard garden to the distant laughter of the Sterlings and the clink of crystal, when I was approached by a retired bookkeeper, Martha Higgins, 61, the woman who had managed the ledgers for my mother's boutique for 15 years, and who knew the financial anatomy of our family better than anyone. Martha looked troubled, her wineglass trembling slightly as she told me that she had been sitting on a secret for 3 years that was eating through her conscience like acid on copper. She told me that in 2021, she had overseen the final reconciliation of a legacy investment account my grandfather had established, a fund of exactly $150,000 that was explicitly documented to be split 50-50 between my brother and me upon our attainment of age 30. She had seen the certified bank statement showing my father transferring my $75,000 share into a business operating account for my brother's Annapolis yacht brokerage just 6 months before I announced my engagement. I kept thinking, my father didn't just withhold a gift. He liquidated a documented inheritance to fund a luxury yacht performance. And he did it because he calculated that my silence was cheaper than his son's failure. He had traded my future for Grant's facade, and he had done it with the notarized coldness of a man who never expected to be audited. The revelation spread through the reception like wine spilling across a white linen tablecloth, impossible to blot out. Martha Higgins wasn't a gossip. She was a woman of professional precision who couldn't let a hypocrisy of that magnitude stand unchallenged in a room full of legal and financial experts. Within an hour, the whispers had reached Julian's partners and the rest of the Philadelphia guests. The St. Clair name which my father had spent 40 years polishing, was being dismantled in real time by the cold, hard facts of his own embezzlement. 3,000 miles away, the consequences were already falling into place like a controlled demolition. My brother Grant was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy 3 weeks later when the forged Cape May deed was flagged by the title insurance company, voiding the collateral for his SBA loan and triggering a default that even my father couldn't subsidize. My father, Arthur, is currently under investigation by the State Ethics Board regarding the misappropriation of the Legacy Trust, a disgrace that has stripped him of his emeritus standing and his consulting contracts. My mother has deactivated her social media accounts and withdrawn from the church choir, her social standing on the main line reduced to a cautionary tale about the price of performative legacy. I received a settlement check for my rightful share of the legacy fund last month, along with a legal restoration of my property rights in Cape May. Not because my parents apologized, but because Julian's attorneys made it clear that the alternative was a criminal indictment for wire fraud. I used the money to start a nonprofit preservation foundation that provides grants for historic restoration to young women in the architectural sciences who don't have a legacy fund to fall back on. I kept thinking, I spent 29 years trying to earn the love of people who saw me as a resource to be mined. And it took losing them to realize that I was the only one in that house who knew how to build something that wouldn't fall down when the wind changed. I think most of us know that feeling. When you finally stop trying to save a ruin and realize that the safest place to be is standing on your own 2 feet, far away from the dust of the collapse. I still have the gold Seiko watch my father gave me at graduation, but I keep it in a locked drawer next to my notarized restoration certificates. I don't wear it because the time it keeps is a fiction I no longer live in. It's a reminder that even the most beautiful facades can hide a rotting interior, and that the strength of a structure isn't determined by the name on the gate, but by the integrity of the stone. I drive my husband to the train station every morning now in a car I paid for myself. And when I look at the Philadelphia skyline, I don't see a legacy I was excluded from. I see a city I helped save stone by stone, and a life that I finally own, unburdened by the guidelines of a dying reputation. I realized that the only way to truly honor the past is to build a future that isn't afraid of the truth, even if that truth burns the house down. I stood on the terrace of City Hall last week, looking out over Broad Street at the historic buildings I've been commissioned to restore, and I realized that I don't need a father's shadow to know that I am worthy of the space I take up. I'm not a temporary fixture in anyone's story anymore. I am the architect of my own. I drive my husband to work every morning in a car I paid for with my own salary, and I don't look for my father's car in the rearview mirror anymore. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, like and subscribe. Because there is always someone sitting in their car right now trying to figure out if they are worth more than the lies their family told them.